pleasure to welcome you all to our third annual MLK Day celebration. We utilize this annual event to reflect upon the life and legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., a man who changed the course of American history. Dr. King led a movement of thousands that liberated millions. His words and ideals continue to provide an aspirational compass for where we as a people and as a nation strive to get. In a world that is often driven by hate, the ugliness of racism, and the walls that divide us, he used love as a weapon and nonviolence as a strategy. His words continue to give us hope even in our current times. Because of him, we know that the moral arc of the universe is long, but that it bends towards justice. The promotion of justice is why we're here today. Using King's legacy as a guide, we hope to discuss and discover how we can promote a more loving and just society. Today, we're in for a very real treat. Having just concluded our podcast, I myself did not know that Dr. Reverend Jeremiah Wright actually knew Dr. King. And so we're actually in for an amazing opportunity to hear a person speak about his life and his legacy who knew him personally. A little bit about the Reverend Dr. Jeremiah Wright, who really needs no introduction if you are familiar with the South Side of Chicago. He's a little bit of an icon, but he deserves, so I'm going to give it to him anyway. Reverend Dr. Jeremiah A. Wright was born in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. He completed his elementary education in that city and then went to Virginia Union University. After 3.5 years at Virginia Union, Pastor Wright left school and entered the United States Marine Corps. He transferred from the Marine Corps into the United States Navy, where he served as a cardiopulmonary technician. After 6 years in the military, Pastor Wright transferred to Howard University. Plug, that's where our new Vice President Kamala Harris also attended. I just like saying that, so you're going to keep hearing that for quite some time from me. But he also went to Howard University, where he completed his undergraduate studies and received his first master's degree. His second master's degree in the history of religions was from the University of Chicago Divinity School. His doctorate was received from the United Theological Seminary under Dr. Samuel DeWitt Proctor. In addition to Dr. Wright's 4 earned degrees, he has been the recipient of 9 honorary doctorates. Reverend Wright became pastor of Trinity United Church of Christ in March of 1972. Within a matter of months, he demonstrated an understanding and deep commitment to help Trinity UCC achieve its motto and vision. The motto being unashamedly Black and unapologetically Christian. It was a phrase that was coined by his predecessor. It was officially adopted by the congregation shortly after Pastor Wright began his ministry. A student of Black sacred music, ethnomusicology, and African diaspora studies, Dr. Wright is a historian of religions. The foundational strengths gained from these studies shaped Dr. Wright's vision for prophetic ministry. As senior pastor of Trinity, where he served 36 years, Dr. Wright combined his studies of West African music and Judeo-Christian thought to create over 70 ministries to address the needs of the community and to enrich the lives and faith of his congregants by moving ministry, as stated in his own words, from theory to praxis. Under Dr. Wright's leadership, the membership of Trinity grew from 87 members in March of 1972 to over 8,000 members while he served as pastor. Dr. Wright has lectured at seminaries and universities across the United States. He is currently an adjunct faculty member at the Ashland Theological Seminary, Lancaster Seminary, the Chicago Theological Seminary, and the Samuel DeWitt Proctor School of Theology at Virginia Union University. He has taught courses at Garrett Evangelical Seminary, the Seminary Consortium for Urban Pastoral Education in Chicago, and Catholic Theological Union. In addition to his seminar teaching responsibilities, Dr. Wright also lectures at colleges and universities in the fields of Africana studies, Black sacred music, African religions, and the African American experience in the Black Atlantic. On May 31st, 2008, Dr. Wright concluded his work as senior pastor of Trinity United Church of Christ. He was voted pastor emeritus of that congregation and now spends his time preaching and teaching seminary. Please join me in giving a big Roosevelt welcome to the Reverend Dr. Jeremiah Wright.
Good afternoon. Before I begin, and being mindful of the short time that we will have to spend together. I would like to thank Dean Jamar Orr, Brother Carl Hunter, and Sister Amanda De Palma. And I'd like to offer a special thanksgiving to Sister Alvelo, whom I have known since she was a little girl, to the Roosevelt community, to the administration, students, faculty, alumni, and visitors to this afternoon's event, the third annual celebration of Dr. King's work, and to the visitors to this afternoon's webinar. I greet you as you honor that legacy of Dr. King's. Your overall theme for this year's event is civil rights and the spirit of resilience that the African American community has demonstrated across the years. For those of you who don't know me, let me say just a word about what you're hearing. I'm a stroke survivor of 4 years, and the stroke rendered the left side of my body challenged. In addition to the challenge of legs, limbs, arms, my vocal cords no longer touch. The left vocal cord has dropped about an inch from the right vocal cord, so it sounds like I have a cold, and you'll hear a little slurring of my speech. That is not because I've been celebrating the inauguration, it's because of the stroke. In order to do justice to your theme, because it is in honor of a minister of the gospel, Dr. King, and also because I am a minister of that same gospel, I would like to establish the framework from which I offer my reflections on your theme by pointing you to the sacred songs of the enslaved Africans and to the Black religious tradition out of which Dr. King came. In addition to knowing Mike, his birth name, I was close to 3 of Dr. King's lieutenants, Congressman Walter Fauntroy, Dr. Wyatt T. Walker, and Dr. William Augustus Jones. It is from the research, scholarship, and ministries of Doctors Walker and Jones that I will make my case. Dr. Wyatt T. Walker was a scholar par excellence of the African American spirituals. Dr. William Augustus Jones was the pastor of Bethany Baptist Church in Brooklyn, New York. Both Doctors Walker and Jones were members of the Henry Mitchell preaching cohort, which did their doctoral studies in the area of African and African American religious studies at Colgate Rochester Crozier Divinity School in Massachusetts. In the Lyman Beecher series of lectures that Dr. Jones presented at the Yale University Divinity School, Dr. Jones, whose lectures have been captured in his book, God in the Ghetto, Bill posits that a flawed theology yields a skewed anthropology and issues forth into a sick sociology. Now, to unpack that, if you can imagine for just a few moments a 3-tiered triangle or a 3-tiered pyramid on both sides of an imaginary line, Bill argues that the base of that pyramid is theology. Theology. How one sees God is the brief working definition of theology that will have to suffice for a short time today. How one sees God, Bill argues, determines how one sees human beings. In other words, your theology determines how you see human beings, or your anthropology, in turn, How you see human beings, your anthropology automatically determines how you shape your world sociologically. Your anthropology determines your sociology. Your theology determines your anthropology. Your anthropology determines your sociology. Now, let's stick with the pyramid on the side of the European and European American reality for just a moment. Historically, Europeans have seen God, their theology, as male, white male, dominant, domineering, warlike, and in a hierarchical position. God is on top. God is in charge. God is up there. God is tyrannical. God is the boss. God is the man upstairs. God is vengeful. God doesn't play. God is always opposed to his unruly creation, and God only blesses those whom God chooses to bless. Now, since that is how God is viewed, doesn't it make sense then that anthropologically, white males are at the top of the food chain? White males are superior in the hierarchical arrangement. White males are over white females. White males over yellow males and yellow females. White males are over red and brown males and females. And at the bottom of that hierarchical arrangement are black males with black females bringing up the rear. That hierarchical way of thinking spreads throughout the culture of European dominant colonized cultures. Things are good when they're up. Are you up for this? Computers only work when they're up. When computers don't work, they are what? Down, up, down. In such a flawed theological and skewed anthropological view of life, it only makes sense then that the society, sociology, is ordered in such a way as to render black bodies commodities where black lives do not matter at all. Black bodies have mattered since the 1400s, but black lives are not considered as important, if in fact existent. They're commodities. Black bodies are commodities can be bought and sold. Commodities, black bodies can be enslaved. Commodities, black women and black men can be raped at will. Commodities are less than human. In some nation states like ours, commodities are chattel, property. Africans are property. They're not even human beings. They are things, not people. Now, on the other side of that imaginary line, the pyramid looks quite differently. The theology on this side of the line sees God as beneficent, gracious, kind, and loving. God is seen in the Judeo-Christian tradition as Emmanuel, or in Hebrew, Emmanuel, which means God with us, not God over us, God alongside of us. God is an ally, God is a friend, God is loving. If that is how God is seen and defined as a result, anthropologically, human beings are seen as made in the image of God. They are always in community. The South Africans call it Ubuntu. Dr. King called it a beloved community. There is not a hierarchy. There is not an over-under arrangement. In those societies where there is regency, in those societies, it is co-regency. Regency. Women are equal to men. Women are partners with men. Women are helpmates, not servants, not slaves, not pieces to be had. They are persons to be honored. Think of the language we use in our culture. I'm going to get a piece, not a whole person. That view anthropologically on this side of the line yields societies that are warm, loving, hospitable, open, welcoming, and humane. Dr. Ivy Lane Carruthers, the CEO of the Samuel DeWitt Proctor Conference, former CEO of the Black Theology Project, said Africans welcomed the Europeans to come as visitors, assuming that they had a home to go back to and that they were going back to their homes. The same thing with the Native Americans, the Lakota, the Cherokee, the Creeks, the Sioux, the Apache. They welcomed the British. They welcomed the Spanish. They welcomed the Portuguese as visitors, thinking they were going to go back home to their home. Now, based upon Dr. William Augustus Jones' paradigm, it is easy to see how such a flawed theology ended up being America's original sin, to quote Jim Wallace. America's original sin, Dr. Wallace says, are slavery and racism. Civil rights, a part of your theme, is not on the table. Civil rights for commodities, for Blacks, for Africans, for Hispanics, for Mexicans whose babies are caged at the border, nowhere on the agenda. How do you give civil rights to an animal? Nobody argues for civil rights for German shepherds. Africans were chattel property. They were listed on the slave manifests of the ships, right alongside the cows, the horses, the wine, the rum, the china, and all the rest of the property being shipped from Ghana, Abidjan, Nigeria, and as far away as Mozambique. The theological problem is written in ink in the Doctrine of Discovery. Please Google it and read it. And written in the sermons of white clergy persons in the British colonies, which later became the United States, teaching that God ordained slavery. That is what their theology taught them. The Doctrine of Discovery went so far as to say that whoever did not convert to Christianity, meaning Western Europeans' definitions of Christianity, not the Christianity of Jesus the Palestinian, the so-called discoverers had the authority of the church, the full weight of the church, a papal bull backing them up to kill those who refuse to drink their toxic Kool-Aid. That understanding of a God who approves slavery, a God who created Native Americans in all three Americas and created Africans from whatever country on the continent of Africa, created them as inferior to Europeans, inferior to the British. That understanding held sway from the 15th century through the 20th century. And as we saw on January 6th of this year, it still holds sway in the 21st century in the most backward of circles. The flawed theological problem, to use Dr. Jones' terminology, easily morphed into the skewed anthropological views of human beings. Charles Mill's work, The Racial Contract, gives you a bibliographical compendium of the racist thinking of the Enlightenment and the Protestant Reformation. Great minds like George Friedrich Hegel. Hegel was famous for his Hegelian method of dialectical thinking, Hegel taught that Africans should not even be included on the chart of humanity. They weren't human beings. They were too stupid. They did not have any brains. Hegel said they certainly had no culture and no history. Newsflash. Thomas Jefferson thought and said the same thing about Phyllis Wheatley. Of course, we must remember that Jefferson wrote those infamous words while sleeping with and having babies by a black teenager named Sally Hemings. If he were alive today, they would call that pedophilia, I believe. Having babies by a teenager. The roots of racism and a complete absence of human rights, much less civil rights, spilled over from the Portuguese and Spanish conquistadores into the Protestantism of the Anglican Church in the British colonies, of which we were one, and to the seat of Anglicanism, the United Kingdom. The quick summary of the theological problem and the anthropological problem help you better understand the sociological problem when it came to law in these United States of America, or as Maya Angelou calls them, these yet to be United States of America. Pennsylvania Supreme Court Judge A. Leon Higginbottom, for instance, demonstrated masterfully in his book titled In the Matter of Color. Higginbottom shows how 150 years of racist laws in the British colony ended up with racism being sewn into the fabric of the Constitution of these United States. Judge Higginbottom shows how each of the 13 colonies adopted laws, you're talking about civil rights. The 13 colonies each adopted laws that were in no way based on legal precedents, no way based on common law from England, we were British colonies, nowhere based on jurisprudence. They were based on whatever the custom was in that colony. From 1630s to 1787, the law in this country, which was then 13 colonies, was based on whatever the custom was. Not 1619, there were no laws on the books of the colony of Jamestown, Virginia. There were no laws in the colony of Penns Woods, Pennsylvania. There were no laws concerning Africans in the colony of Massachusetts, city on the hill, ordained of God. Why were there no laws? Because there were no blacks in those colonies. By 1631, however, laws started appearing in each of the colonies because, why? African women were having babies by non-Africans. The question became, what race are we going to call these kids? The racism starts to show the kids will forever follow the race of the mother, with the assumption being that no white woman dare have a baby by a black African, enslaved or free. After 100 years, to be more exact, 150 years of legally denying Africans of their rights, it is easily understandable as to how the framers of the Constitution in 1787 could put together a document that is boldly racist and built on the premise of white supremacy. Dr. Khalil Gibran Muhammad, PhD from Harvard, demonstrates in his work, The Condemnation of Blackness, how the field of sociology is patently racist. The Association of Black Psychologists had already demonstrated that same reality in the field of so-called scientific psychology. Dr. Muhammad shows us how learned psychologists, PhD, and tenured professors opined that the darker one's complexion was, the more likely they were to commit a crime. Do you expect this field or the field of sociology to be leading the charge for civil rights for African Americans? Slavery by Another Name, the book, shows us how the convict lease system continued the practices of legally denying rights to the Africans from the end of slavery up until the 1950s. Coming into modern times and fast forwarding because of our lack of time, Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness, and Dr. Garrick Faria's recently published book, American Terrorism, A Brief Legal History of the Lynching of Black Folk in the United States. Those two works demonstrate how the legal rights, the human rights, and the civil rights of Blacks have been completely ignored, denied, thrown under the bus, trashed, or crushed by bloom bloom, law and order. White folks are the law, Black folks out of order in New York City. Bloom bloom. The chosen theme for this year's Martin Luther King observance is on Black resiliency, and that takes us back across the line to the other pyramid. How is it that African Americans were able and have been able to be so resilient in the face of pure hatred, in the face of such a rancid history, in spite of white privilege, in spite of white racism, in spite of white hatred of Blacks, in spite of American exceptionalism, and in spite of Trumpism? The short answer takes me to Dr. Wyatt T. Walker, whom I mentioned earlier. Dr. Charles Long, the preeminent historian of religions from the University of Chicago Divinity School, takes me back to Langston Hughes and takes me to the music of enslaved Africans for an answer to those questions. A clue, if not some would argue the key to African American resilience while, quote, singing the Lord's song in a strange land, quote. The clue for me and the key for many is found in their sacred songs. I've been buked and I've been scorned. I've been talked about, shows you're born. Roosevelt students, please notice I am using African English, African American English, not I have been rebuked. I was preaching in Cuba one year, and the translators with our group were only 4. The members of our group were 30. And on the Sunday that we were there for the Black Theology Project, we each had to preach at a different Christian church in Cuba. Yes, Maria. Yes, Felicia, there are Christians in Cuba. With only 4 translators, that meant that all of us didn't have a translator for our sermons, and all of us couldn't speak Spanish fluently. So I had a local pastor translating for me, and I quoted this spiritual, doing an illustration, and I've been buked. He had no clue what I was talking about. He was bucked. So I bucked. I said, no, buked. There's no word in Spanish for buked. There's no word in the standard business English language for buked. It is what Geneva Smitherman calls the language of Black America. I've been, not I have been, but I've been buked and I've been scorned. I've been talked about, show as you're born. That's one of the hundreds of sacred songs which demonstrates the attitude of the enslaved Africans And don't let me run past the word been too rapidly. Geneva Smitherman in her book, Talking and Testifying, has a whole section on the verb to be and the way African speakers of English use the verb to be. The verb to be is omitted when you want to show immediacy. When the speaker says, where your mama? Not where is your mother? Where your mama? The hearer knows you mean right now. The answer is she at home, not she is at home. It is omitted to show immediacy. It is inserted to show ongoing activity. Like what your mama doing Sunday? Girl, she be going to church and stuff. When you say she be going, that means it don't never stop. I've been buked, past tense. Been buked. There is no helping verb. You were taught in English, standard business English, that when you use the past participle been, you have to have a helping verb, not for Africans. You just getting in there, I've been here. The speaker means I have been here. The hearer knows me. You have been here a long time. I've been buked means it's something that goes on and on, don't never stop. I've been buked. I've been scorned. I've been talked about. Sure as you're born. That's one of the sacred songs which demonstrates the attitude of the enslaved Africans who sang while living in the midst of a world with chains around their bodies and with laws enforcing those chains, with a promise legally in the Constitution of the country that maybe by 1808, slavery would be abolished in the United States. The second verse of Robin Buke says, dare, not there. There is no TH sound in West African languages. African American speakers of English take the TH sound and change it to a D. This afternoon, we're going to listen to Jeremiah Wright. Then we're going to get some D. We'll change it to an N. Where were you Thursday? I was looking for you. I was with Mama and them. At the end of a word, we'll change it to an F, like loofah or Roosevelt. Where are you from? South Side. Beginning of a word, a D. There is trouble all over this world. That's not bad English. That's West African speech pattern. Second verse of that same song says, there is trouble all over this world. There is trouble all over this world. There is trouble all over this world. There was trouble on the continent of Africa from which they were stolen. There's trouble in Portugal, and the Portuguese enslavers are a classic example of that trouble. There was trouble in Spain, and there was trouble in Britain. There was trouble in the Netherlands. There was trouble in Holland. There was trouble in France, and there was trouble in Germany. The treatment the Africans received from merchants from each of those countries let them know daily that there was trouble all over this world. The song does not end there, however. The third verse of that same spiritual says, there may be trouble, but I ain't gonna lay my religion down. I ain't gonna lay my religion down. Listen carefully. I ain't gonna lay my religion down. That is an echo of the spirit, another spiritual, which says, over my head, I hear music in the air. There must be a God somewhere. Like Langston Hughes' poem, Mother to Son, encapsulates these sentiments with a mother who has known hard times and who has known nothing but trouble in this world, encouraging her son by saying to him, I'm still climbing, boy. I'm still climbing. The resiliency of her desire, her will, and her determination to keep climbing in spite of the racism she faced on a daily basis, in spite of the sexism she lived with from the day she drew her first breath until the day she was talking to her son in this poem, are evidences of a faith that James Weldon Johnson says, a faith that the dark past has taught us. The enslaved Africans call it religion. Ain't gonna lay my religion down. Dr. Charles Long reminds us, as an historian of religions, that the religions of the enslaved Africans on all three countries called America were made manifest, and whether they were in the Christian church, in the Muslim faith, in Santeria, in Kumina, or Candomblé, those religions which make up the sacred family of the Black religious tradition, all hark back to the original meaning of religio, or what enslaved Africans called religion, to bind, that which binds one, not in a negative sense. Dr. Long pointed out before his death, religio means that to which you are bound and those to whom you are bound. Ain't gonna lay my religion down. The Africans were able to rebound, pardon the pun. They were able to show resiliency because they were bound to each other, crammed together in the slave castles on the west coast of Africa, crammed together in the slave holds of the ships that took anywhere from 3 weeks and a half to 6 months to cross the Atlantic, crammed together in the hovels of the plantations, forced to undergo the seasoning process where the Fon, the Ga, the Ibu, the Hausa, the Akan, the Ewe, the Ashanti, and the Yoruba were intentionally separated from family members, from loved ones, and thrown together with total strangers who did not speak the same language. These enslaved Africans cobbled together a new language. I've been talking about it for a minute now. Dr. Geneva Smith in his book, Talking, apostrophe, no G on it, no talking, no West African words end in hard syllables like talking. They don't have words that end like this. Those are Indo-European Germanic words. There was a soft at the end, Abidjan, Kwame Nkrumah, Djibouti, Ghana, Ewe, talking apostrophe, and testifying apostrophe, the language of Black America. Dr. Smitherman gives the untutored reader an introduction to and a brief overview of that cobbled together language in one of the three Americas in the United States. While lecturing on linguistics in Miami, Florida, a linguist ran up to me with tears in her eyes from Cuba. She said the same principles Dr. Geneva Smitherman writes about in her book, What I've Been Teaching Spanish-Speaking Speakers of English. In all three Americas, they've cobbled together a language that has all of the elements of every language in the world: pragmatics, syntax, semiotics, grammar, and phonics. Dr. Long argues accurately that those Africans also cobbled together a religion. Ain't gonna lay my religion down. It doesn't say Baptist religion, Methodist religion, Presbyterian religion. Ain't gonna lay my religion. They cobbled together a religion, a new faith, a tertium quid, third entity is what Dr. Gaylord Wilmore calls it. Their new faith was filled with the hope that the present brought them in spite of the hell that they lived through in the present. That faith was practiced most often away from the eyes of slave masters and away from the ears of Uncle Toms. That faith was freely practiced in the hush arbors and the brush arbors of the woods in the deep South. Their religio, religion, had bound them into a true single garment of destiny, to use King's words. And that new religion reminded them daily that they were human, even though their slave masters said otherwise. They were reminded by their new faith and their new religion and their songs that there is a God, must be a God somewhere. In spite of the godless behavior they saw and were forced to undergo from slave owners, slave drivers, and slave overseers, they were bound together, religio, because of a love that could not be crushed and because of a fire within that could not be extinguished. It burned on the inside and it still burns today. Their hope and our hope is not in the empire. Their hope and our hope is not in the colonial powers. Their hope and our hope is not in Barack Obama or Kamala Harris. Both Barack and Kamala have achieved success in being elected to the highest offices in the land. But our faith, our religio, our religion, teaches us that they were elected to the highest offices in the empire. As the sacred songs of the enslaved Africans say, our hope is in God. Our hope is a hope that does not disappoint. Our hope is a hope that cannot be extinguished, and a hope that not only carried us over a way that with tears has been watered, treading our path through the blood of the slaughtered, but it is also a hope that has us daily facing the rising sun of a new day begun. No, James Clyburn, this cannot be a national hymn because everybody, no V, everybody ain't tread their path through the blood of the slaughtered or come over a way that with tears has been watered. May God bless you, and may their hope and our hope sustain you in the days which lie ahead. Ashe.
Wow, 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 wow. Reverend Wright, I just want to personally thank you for that history lesson, for that sermon, for that language and history and linguistics, right? He really did take us on a journey, and it was one that I will not soon forget. So thank you, thank you, thank you. At this point, we're going to go to our question and answer period. And for that, I'm going to turn it over to the Assistant Director of Multicultural Student Support Services, Carl Hunter.
All right, thank you once again. So if you all wouldn't mind putting your questions in the chat, or you can unmute yourself as well if you have questions you want to ask Dr. Wright. I'm getting lots of praise in the chat so far. Lots of praise, lots of thank yous. Anyone, don't be shy.
If I may, Carl, for those who don't know, Reverend Wright and I had a pre-conversation in which we talked about a few things for the President's podcast. And one of the areas that came up in our conversation was really centered around the idea of Dr. King's beloved community. And Reverend Wright, you gave a really phenomenal answer to my question of being whether or not his hope for the achievement of that beloved community was at this point in time, given everything that's going on, if that is still even a realistic hope and possibility. So might you be able to speak a little bit toward that question for this audience?
Yes, the last part of your question in our podcast was about the beloved community and what advice I would give the students at Roosevelt. And I have shared with you another one of my mentors' sayings that I have adopted as a mantra. Janice Hale, in her 1972 book, Black Children, Their Culture, Cognitive, and Learning Styles, pointed out, and maybe I should say something about how she came to that, Jamar. In the field of education, Roosevelt students majoring in education, up until the 70s, early 70s, we had been comparing African American students to European American students. And we kept coming up with funny terms like EMH, TMH, ADH, reading, writing, and Richland. And Janice, education major, decided to stop comparing African Americans to European Americans, but comparing African students to African Americans, European students to European Americans. And she found that they had different ways of learning. And with that being the backstory, she coined the phrase that I've adopted, different, and there are different ways of learning. Difference does not mean deficiency. Seeing somebody who is different as deficient is what causes white supremacy. You have to become like me if you need to be acceptable. You have to speak as I speak. You have to sing European music, classical music. You have folk ditties. Those aren't serious music. They're not worthy of serious study. The only drama, of course, is Shakespeare, Edward Albee. No mention of Lorraine Hansberry or any Black playwright, because anything Black is deficient. Unless students learn how to push by that and learn that those, first of all, God, I'm sorry for those of you who don't believe in God, this is me, he asked me. God loves diversity. No two snowflakes are alike. No two persons have the same DNA. We're different. That does not make one of us deficient and the other one efficient. It just means different. If we could learn that and begin to learn each other's cultures, begin to learn each other's beliefs, and see each other as human beings of the same race, that would be the first and most important step, as I see it, toward building the beloved community. Right now, we live in balkanized silos, and we do not see each other as brother or sister. King kept using the term my brother. What you saw on January 6th is folk who will never see you as a brother as long as they see you through the lens of white supremacy, white privilege, Confederacy. They think they won the war. They think they were cheated out of that war like they were cheated out of an election. As long as we maintain that balkanized silo perspective, we cannot build a community. I was asking Jamar in the podcast, did he remember porches? And he shared with me his grandmother had a front porch. People who sit on, back in those days, sat on the front porch, knew everybody who walked by the porch, knew all the kids in the block, knew whose family they belonged to. That was a community. Desegregation, not integration, but desegregation has caused us to move to the suburbs where we no longer have front porches. We moved the front porch to the back and now call it a deck where I don't have to see my neighbors. Instead of parking in front, speaking to Ms. Wilson, Ms. Robinson, Ms. Tyree on the way in, I pull into my garage with a garage opener. It goes down behind me and I'm siloed for the night. Most Blacks I know cannot name everybody in that living complex. in the suburbs. We don't know our neighbors, and we don't know we'll ever see them as us versus them, they, those people. You know how all Black people are this, all Mexicans are this, all Latinos are this, all Chinese, and we know absolutely nothing about the original inhabitants of this land, some of whom are students right there at Roosevelt. Tell me 3 things about the Lakota that make them different from the Apache or the Pueblo. Name 4 Sioux chiefs. We don't know them. Why? To use perfectly phonetically articulated English a la Cat Williams. Every United States has broken every treaty we have with Native Americans. We kidnap them and make them white to civilize them. We don't know anything at all about their history, their culture. Peyote, oh, they get high. It's all right to get high if you're an Indian. I'm gonna be an Indian. Those kind of stereotypes keep us separated, and until we can tear down the walls of separation that keep us from seeing our sister and our brother as our sister and our brother, we won't have a community. If we do and when we do, will be the first step, if not the major step, toward being the beloved community Dr. King talked about. Did I remember everything we talked about, Jamal?
I don't know how you did, but you did.
So we have some more questions in the chat, and of course we want to be respectful of time. We are getting close to the 2 o'clock mark, so we do understand that people have to head out. But I'm going to go ahead with the rest of the questions here in the chat. First question is: if you were teaching a course on the theology of Martin Luther King, what text would you use, if any?
I would use his book, Where Do We Go From Here? I would use James Washington's book, The Collected Sermons of Martin Luther King, and I would use James Cone's book, Martin, Malcolm, and the American.
Great, great.
Is that undergrad? Is that an undergrad course at the chat? Because of his graduate school, I got 5 more books for graduate students to read.
Let's keep going. The religion you stated the slaves pierced together. What was it that precursor to?
What you see is the Black church today. I omitted another ingredient in what Gaylord Wilmore calls a tertium quid. There's some African traditional religious practices that became a part of the Black church tradition and Black religion. Before I be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave. That's a song which refuses to grant permission to a slaveholder to rule over them. Africans, the Association of Black Psychologists put it this way: enslaved Africans were never, most of them, never slaves, pardon me. They were in bondage. To be a slave, you have to give psychological assent to the enslaver. And the Africans who sang those songs never gave psychological assent. They said, I told Jesus it would be all right if he changed my name. Not a white slave master, not a different plantation changing my name everywhere I go. Only the one who made me has power over me to change my name. So what becomes precursor? And what scares, this is the university, so Dr. Martin Marty, my primary church history professor, told me I needed to stop quoting people because every time I quote somebody, I get in trouble. People attribute the quote to me and forget all about the one who really said it. But there's a quote that Geneva Smitherman has in her last book that's hilarious. Because of the precursors being a combination and cobbled together of the Akan tradition, the Yoruba tradition, Candomblé, Santeria, Kumina, Methodism, Baptist, Maroon. What scares many whites on 2 counts, which the lady down in Georgia tried to use, throwing my name in to scare people away from Warnock, is not only the rhetoric and the speech, Brother Hunter, but getting happy, the sacred dance, which harks back to 2 Samuel, where the only way the Spirit will come over you is ecstasy, spiritual ecstasy, dance in the sacred dance. Well, when a PhD in, say, nuclear physics from Roosevelt walks into a black church and sees folks shouting and doing the dance, which is from Africa, that's scary. Geneva Smitherman said, when I start talking in Black English, communicating with my congregation, not as a politician trying to win votes, but talking to my folk who are believers as I am. Geneva Smitherman says in her last book is Articulate While Black or Articulate While Black. She says when Black preachers slip over into a language that only Black parishioners are common to, you decode it using coded language, quote, white folks don't know whether to shit or go blind when they hear Jeremiah Wright, unquote. But that too is part of the precursor, the coded language that Africans use whenever they suspected an outsider might be, everybody of skin color ain't your kinfolk, might be running back telling mouths what they're doing. Or if a white person was present in worship who was not a part of the in group, who is not proven to be a part of the accepted coded language group. Paul Laurence Dunbar wrote a poem that describes it, Slave Religion. The last couplet, no, the last quatrain, as he's railing on about Pharaoh in a Bible-istic way, talking about Master Pharaoh, don't know that African children need to be set free. Somebody white walks in, and you can tell by the way he switches to, oh, children, let us pray. He stops his sermon cold and goes into, oh, children, let us pray. Well, that's part of the question. We'll go to the precursors in the tertium quid, African traditional religions, African speech, African dance, African coded language, African coded spirituals, African music, African sermons, and European religion. Al Robideau's book, Slave Religion, talks about different ways that Africans were converted, some through catechesis, like the Anglican Church, the AME Church, any church with the Episcopacy and the Presbyterian Church. But the Baptists had a different bar standard for conversion, which was a personal experience of the Spirit. So all of those put together are precursors.
Okay. All right, well, thank you so much. So we are over time, so we do appreciate everyone for your questions and your comments and just for being here today. I'm going to go ahead and give it back over to our director, Emily, and she's going to close us out.
Thank you so much, Carl, for leading the discussion and question portion. And thank you again, Reverend Wright. You have always been very instrumental in my life. You know, I took my recordings, if you remember when Trinity used to take the recordings from service, I took those with me to college and they got me through when I couldn't come to church on Sunday. So your words have always been a point of inspiration and critical thinking. And I'm so grateful that you were able to bring that to our Roosevelt community today. And so thank you again. Love and light to you always. And thank you so much to the Roosevelt community for joining us today. We very much appreciate and hope that you are as inspired and hopeful and thoughtful and you know, thinking and processing everything. All like this will be recorded so you can rewatch it later. So for the community. So I just want to thank everybody again.
Thank you.
And Pastor Wright, it looks like you have a few members who are trying to say hello and wave to you.